Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Hey, Adapters. Welcome back to the podcast. Yes, this is truly an exciting episode. My guest is journalist Amy Westervelt. Amy's the founder of the Critical Frequency Podcast Network and host of Drilled, a true crime-style podcast about climate change. Amy and I go behind the scenes on how she constructs a Drilled episode, focusing on how the fossil fuel industry created the modern public relations industry. We also discuss the emerging popularity of climate podcasts, and we assess how the media is doing covering the issue of climate change. Those and many more subjects are covered in this amazing conversation with Amy. I hope you enjoy the conversation. I know I did. Okay, we have started a bi-weekly newsletter here at America Adapts. We highlight the latest episode and news and stories related to that episode's topic. We also highlight other climate pods and share a few other adaptation-related goodies. In the show notes, there's a link to subscribe. Please do. And the next episode of America Adapts is The Fundamentals of Climate Change and National Security. My guest is Commander Andrea Cameron, who is a military professor in the National Security Affairs Department and the director of the Climate and Human Security Studies Group at the Naval War College. That was an amazing conversation, so look for that one. Okay, Adapters, let's join in with Amy Westervelt and go behind the scenes in the wonderful world of climate podcasting. Hey, Adapters. Today I have a very exciting episode. My guest is journalist Amy Westervelt. Amy is the founder of the Critical Frequency Podcast Network and host of Drilled, a true crime-style podcast about climate change. Hey, Amy, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me.
I am so excited about this conversation that we're about to have. We chatted in advance, but I'm telling you, it was really hard to structure my episode. There was going to be too many topics, but I'm really excited about this. Let's just get started. We're going to cover climate communication, but I want to talk about your podcast too, and obviously some episodes that you do, but let's just get started with Drilled. What is it? What do you cover on there?
Yeah, I got into doing audio after doing print journalism for maybe 15 years on climate. And almost from like the first, week of my job I took a job as a community reporter for a public radio station in Reno to learn audio. And immediately I was like, how can I do climate stories that are more narrative and that tell some of the stories behind what's happening. And it took me a really long time to figure out how to do that because, as you well know, there's so much scientific and technical information that you feel compelled to share with people that sometimes things like character and plot are not top of mind. And maybe like 5 years into doing audio stuff, I was in a courtroom in San Francisco covering the climate liability trial there. So the cities of San Francisco and Oakland had sued, I think it was the top 30 oil companies, and they wanted them to pay some portion of the cost for climate adaptation. And the judge in that case had a reputation for being kind of an eccentric guy, and he had taught himself to code to adjudicate a Oracle case, and he had taught himself all about self-driving cars to rule on a Google case and all of these things. And so he asked for a climate science tutorial in San Francisco, and it was more of a history of science, sort of wanting to get a sense of what was known and when and who knew what and that kind of thing. And so I was in this courtroom in San Francisco, and there were, oil company lawyers and environmental lawyers, and the scientists had shown up to testify. And it just kind of hit me oh, this is a great framework to tell a lot of different types of climate stories because people are kind of familiar with the structure of legal cases, And so initially I just was going to do the first season, which kind of looked at the origin story of climate denial, kind of how that came about and how it was spread. And then in the course of reporting that, I just came across kind of more and more stories. So now we're on season 5 right now, and I've got at least 2 more seasons planned out. And I feel like I'll probably find more in reporting those. So I don't know how long it's going to go.
Okay, so I want to talk about this sort of, you're using the podcast medium. And so you call it a true crime climate change podcast, which is very, clever because people love true crime podcasts. Was that thinking early on? And I just want to say to people out there, if you haven't listened to Drilled, you create really a nice atmosphere. And so you've got these seasons. It's almost, you must be doing that on purpose. You're almost going for these like TV. I mean, you've created a great atmosphere around a climate podcast.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That was intentional. I mean, that was my original kind of thought was, I'm going to do a true crime podcast about climate change. And this was maybe 2 or 3 years ago when the true crime boom was really taking off. I feel like it hasn't really stopped since then.
Right. No.
But anyway, yeah, I thought, okay, this is like a genre that people are kind of familiar with. It's a little bit unexpected to get a climate story in this format. Like we can have some fun with that and, kind of take people through stuff that can otherwise be kind of dry. I mean, that was kind of my thinking too, is that the Exxon news story had been really well reported by Inside Climate News and the LA Times, the Columbia Journalism School, a couple years before this trial, but it seemed like a lot of people still just didn't know that story and didn't know a lot of the history behind sort of how oil companies helped to create climate denial and, the implications of that and whatnot. So it seemed to me like, if people could hear someone who had worked on climate research at Exxon kind of telling that story, it might sink in more,
You likely have to plan well in advance about what your seasons are going to be. I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, it's really involved. I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand that there's a really wide range of time and effort required for podcasts, like
right.
That if you're doing something that's super narrative, yeah, it kind of is like working on a TV show. I mean, I usually start reporting about a year before the season comes out. And then, a few months before we're really producing episodes, I storyboard them, I've got a wall of Post-its and I'm moving things around and all that kind of stuff. So, and then, I commission music for each one and try to figure out, like what the vibe is going to be. Like this current season is probably closer to the traditional true crime approach than any of our other seasons. It's like kind of one episodic story or I guess serialized story from episode 1 to episode 10. And it's telling kind of a suspenseful story with a central character or two and all of that. But I don't know. So anyway, yeah, it takes me a while. And then I write out scripts and I edit them. And then we do, table reads and rough cuts. And I have a fact checker who goes through and does a detailed fact check. And then I have a lawyer who reviews everything. So it's quite involved.
Wow. Like that whole team. Yeah. I'm a one person shop and, I'm a policy guy. And so I'm having these policy kind of wonky, but you have to do that with what you're doing. You can get yourself into, I guess, some trouble with the people that you're targeting. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It must be frustrating for you, or maybe it isn't, that, okay, you spend all this time and you put all this thought into mapping out these seasons, but climate change is very real time too, and you can't be as reactive to that. So there must be a little bit of friction of like, gosh, I'd really like to cover the story that just came out in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, there is. And that's how my feed got so cluttered with bonus episodes. Because I feel like I think I just went through and pulled quite a few of them out. But, even actually like our 4th season was not a planned season. That just, ended up being kind of a spur of the moment thing, because maybe 2 weeks before a lot of the big loan programs and things were being announced and like royalty relief and whatnot for oil and gas companies, I saw a lot of think tanks and organizations that are connected to the fossil fuel industry accusing Democrats of trying to use COVID to push the Green New Deal. And I was like, that's weird, because Nancy Pelosi is the one that's pushing a lot of the COVID relief stuff for the Dems, and she's not a big fan of the Green New Deal. And also, usually these guys' biggest tell is that they sort of start accusing their opponents of doing stuff in the lead up to them doing it. And so I started looking into it, and sure enough, it was like the API had already, sent a letter to President Trump and met with him a couple times, and there were all kinds of things in the works. And I thought that we needed to cover that stuff. So we ended up doing, it's like 18 episodes or something that season, just covering all of the various things that the fossil fuel industry was kind of doing amidst the pandemic, and also like the way the pandemic was impacting the industry and what impact that might have on climate policy, all of that stuff. Yes.
So that's
the
yeah. Beauty of being a podcaster. You can be that flexible. So that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to come right back to some of the topics of your drilled, but I do want to ask you that climate podcasts, there are more and more coming out, and your thoughts on the field at the moment. And is there any area that you feel is missing that we probably need to hear more voices in that space?
Yeah. I'm really excited to see the big boom in climate podcasting this year in particular. I feel like there's just been an explosion of shows, which is great, because when I was first starting Drilled, I initially tried to pitch it to some of the larger podcast companies and was basically told that nobody had proven that there wasn't a large enough audience for climate shows to justify like a production budget. I'm very pleased that clearly that has changed. So yeah, no, I'm thrilled to see the boom in climate podcasts. I definitely was told that there just wasn't enough of an audience to justify investing any money at all into climate podcasts. So like seeing, especially like larger companies like, Gimlet, and I've heard that Vice is working on one, and it's great. I think it's really great to see that, there's apparently a large enough audience that it's worth it for some of these bigger companies to try to invest money in this space. But I do think that, honestly, I'm kind of surprised that there aren't more shows trying to do narrative. So I guess that's good for me. Yeah, I'm not sure why there still seems to be kind of a lack of shows telling stories related to climate, and certainly a lack of kind of climate justice podcasts. There's definitely a dearth of people of color doing climate podcasts. So I still think there's room. I also definitely want to see, and I think there's a few people probably working on this, but I think it would be cool to see something focused on the psychology side too, and addressing climate anxiety and climate grief and all that kind of stuff.
I recently had Renee Lertzman on, and I know you've referenced her in one of your recent articles.
She's great. Yeah.
Yeah. And, my thoughts on the climate podcast space is like, I've been around like 4 years, which is like ancient for a lot of podcasts.
Yeah, you're like a godfather in this space.
Gosh, I'm not in controlling anything, but I think to your point, though, like the bigger networks and people that actually have deeper pockets, I guess that's encouraging. And with the notion of being narrative, though, like what you do with your podcast, you just described, that takes a lot of effort. A lot of people, actually getting paid. And so I interact a lot with more independent podcasters. These are like 1 or 2 person shops, and they're really just the funding. And so they have been the one occupying the space. And so getting those deeper pockets, that's what it takes, I think, for the narrative, what you just described. That sort of time and effort. And I think that's partly one of the reasons why. But I hope, as you said, this year, maybe we'll see more of those.
I hope so. And just to be clear, I'm also like I hire people off at on, contract for a few hours of doing this and a few hours of doing that. But the first season of Drilled, I did everything, and I taped in my car.
Wow, okay, great.
So it's not impossible to do it, but it's hard. Like I feel like, we've built a pretty good sized audience, and we have some grants coming in now and some advertising and things like that, but it's still I think I'm like maybe pulling a part-time salary now, maybe. It's rough.
For those of you out there, don't go think you're striking it rich if you're starting your climate podcast. That's our advice to you.
This is not, well, yeah, I think people do still kind of have that idea about the podcast space that like, you can start a show and build an audience and like the money will just flow. In fact, I just had a conversation with someone who very much was like surprised. She was like, yeah, I thought that I would be able to quit my job, but my advertising revenue is only like $50 a month. Like, welcome to podcasting. Yeah.
And she's doing better than probably 70-80% of all podcasts if she's getting that $50 too. So that's the nature of it. I think a lot of people too is they go and they're so excited, and that's great. I've been an ambassador. I've mentored quite a few podcasts, and they hit publish and they think it's going to change the world and they're going to get 25,000 downloads that first episode, and you're just you gotta plan the long game. Unless you're like the NPR kind of type or New York Times types, you're not doing that.
Yeah, well, and especially now it is more and more crowded. I think I was talking to someone at Apple the other day, and they were saying that they had more shows launching in September this year than they've ever had in any month ever, because I think a lot of people, made making a podcast their COVID project. So yeah, it's harder and harder to get ears on there.
I listen to podcasts about podcasting. Libsyn is my host, and I listen to them, and so they give you the inside scoop. They're just like, well, out of that 1.5 million podcasts, there's like 300,000 that are actively publishing. So it's a bit of a mirage. People pod fade all the time. They blast two or three, and they're just like, wait a sec, I'm not as big as the Joe Rogan. What? Well, just before we get to the next section, I just want to say some of the people that I talk to, and I don't know if you have these conversations, I am always encouraging like different groups or individuals to get into the podcast space if they're ready for it. And I talk to a lot of big conservation groups or, environmental groups, and I'm shocked how few of them have podcasts. And I've discovered part of the problem is that they all have big communication shops. And there's like this tension between the communication shops are there to make the CEO or the executive director look good, and then they're also there to tell the story of that organization. And so it turns a potential podcast into mush. You really need an identity, and that's part of their problem. But they have potential for great stories, and most of them can't get their act together.
Totally. I've seen that for a while in the print space too. Like I remember someone contacted me from a large nonprofit that I won't name because I don't want to embarrass them. And it's not, it's not really embarrassing. It's just indicative of sort of kind of how aware a lot of people in the nonprofit space are of sort of how media works and how journalism works. And anyway, someone contacted me on LinkedIn, and they wanted me to like write a story about something they were doing and then pitch it to the New Yorker and somehow guarantee them that they would have a feature in the New Yorker. I was like, that's not how it works, but I feel like it's similar with the podcast stuff. I've talked to, some organizations and companies too that want to do kind of like their own podcast, and they are expecting to get, the same sort of audience that like, a New York Times podcast or whatever, like an NPR podcast, or even like an independent, not branded in any way podcast would get. And it's like, well, people, I don't know. You have to like think through what's going to make people tune in, and like, is it an interview with your CEO? Probably not.
No. And as I explain it, that I follow the downloads and trends and all that, you can be in the top 20% of all podcasts, but the difference between top 20% and top 1% is light years. They're light years. And so a lot of people don't get it. So, but that you don't need to view podcasting like that. If you're getting X amount, which doesn't sound like a big number, it's just like, listen, these people are coming up and consistently listening to you. You should be quite happy with that depending on what you're doing. So,
yeah. I mean, I think too that, there is this, so something, as you've probably learned if you were Googling me, I'm pretty bad at just staying with one thing.
Yeah, you're right.
But I have been wanting for a while to figure out a way to get more of the great content that's being produced in the podcast space onto terrestrial radio. And, of course, there's like the iHeart radio people that are doing that because they own both, right? But there's a lot of other stations that, have a need for content and have huge audiences. And the way that the vast majority of Americans actually get news is radio, which I don't think people realize, a lot of people. And, even stuff like, I don't know, a lot of people get their daily news from like, a morning drive time show. And those hosts they're not journalists and they're not being paid to like report things. They're just kind of being handed a bunch of headlines in the morning. Anyway, I feel like there's this weird thing happening where there's this enormous audience on terrestrial radio and an enormous amount of content being produced in the podcast space. And the only thing that's sort of keeping them from integrating is sort of like the podcast advertising model, which seems silly.
This is an unusual way, but I've discovered, and a fraction of my listeners are on YouTube, but a lot of people actually, cool. But it's still just a fraction, but a lot of people, and I've advertised there just to experiment. You get a group, like to get a grant and like you're getting $1,000 and you want to promote 10 episodes. You'd be shocked at the sort of the listens that you might get. It might actually be a more targeted way than the radio station. It's this, and 1,000 will really get you some exposure on YouTube. It's actually, that's
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know. I feel like I keep learning about that and then I keep forgetting it, but really it is a lot of people listen to their podcasts on YouTube.
Yeah, I was just playing around, and my YouTube listening is just almost nothing, but you put it everywhere, right? That's how a podcaster works. And so I did a little bit of advertising. I think it was $50 or something like that, and the numbers jumped a few thousand from what was right. And so
that's great.
You really should, if that's something you're serious about, is maybe there's a foundation that wants to get the message out, and you're like, all right, for some small grants, we can kind of do some targeting of our podcast. So anyway, something.
Yeah. Hey, if Prager University can do it.
Oh, shit. Prager. Okay, we really went off on a tangent on podcasting, but but I love talking podcasting with other podcasters, but I'm sure listeners too want to hear more. And I want to pivot right back to Drilled. And there's too much content to sort of like, let's go over all these things. But, some things that you highlighted for me that I dug into is season 3, and was looking at how the fossil fuel industry created the modern public relation industry. And correct me if that's sort of not a great description, but could you describe what you were doing with season 3?
Yeah, absolutely. So in sort of the aftermath of the first 2 seasons, which were really focused on like climate denial and disinformation and all of that, I was doing more and more research and just thinking through and actually talking to a couple of sociology researchers too about their work and how, really the science disinformation stuff only worked because there had been this sort of groundwork laid for a century before about how great and important and necessary fossil fuels were. So I wanted to sort of dig into that history. And there is this thing, like you can kind of see throughout history that the industry will sort of lean on one lever or the other depending on what's happening in the policy realm. Like if it looks like there is about to be regulation passed, depending on sort of the way that the culture is at any given time, they'll kind of push the idea of the industry as being really critical and really innovative and part of the solution and whatever, or they'll lean on the disinformation side. So I felt like it was important for people to understand both sides. And now, I'm seeing that now because almost immediately when Biden was elected, although I know there's still apparently some debate about that, there was, instantly I was seeing like American Petroleum Institute ads around how they're part of the climate solution. So
I want to dig into the notion of and maybe how the climate movement, I guess, learns from it. But could you also briefly describe Herb Schmert?
Oh, Herb Schmert's my favorite. Yes, he's kind of my favorite of these characters. So this is the other thing that I think is helpful for me in looking at this stuff, and hopefully for other people too, is like sometimes it can feel really overwhelming. These guys have been kind of controlling the story and shaping how people think about energy for 100 years. What hope do we have, right? But when you start to kind of dig into it and peel back the layers, it's like a fairly small handful of specific people, And one of those people was Herb Schmertz, who was the VP of Public Affairs for Mobil Oil for, 20, 30 years. Mm-hmm. And he really created a lot of the strategies that we still see in use today. So he worked with the New York Times to create the advertorial. He kind of created sponsored content across the board. I mean, he worked with PBS to have Mobil sponsor Masterpiece Theater and used that to kind of bolster public opinion of Mobil as sort of the thinking man's oil. He also was quite good at kind of weaponizing ideas of objectivity against journalists. So he talked about this later in life in an interview where he would just sort of go after any journalist that printed a story that was critical of Mobil and accused them of being biased for not including Mobil's opinion. And, he's like, yeah, it was a tactic to get them to cover our side of things. And it worked. I think it convinced a lot of people that they needed to have an oil executive's take on environmental regulation, or else their story was somehow biased against the industry. So, yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff, it seems small, but you just sort of see it in like most news coverage still today of the climate issue.
So when he was doing all this, I guess I want to say the 50s, 60s, and 70s, did I get that right?
He started in the 60s and then he went through the 80s.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And I'm trying to describe what he did. And so the media behaved a certain way. And so Herb decided that he wanted it to behave a different way. He was bending it to his will as I was listening, I'm just like, gosh, he just didn't like how they behaved. And so he wanted to change it. And I guess one of the questions I have for you is, as he was doing this, and it sounds bad, right? It sounds, he's attacking the journalists and such. But then it occurred to me, it's like, is anything he's doing illegal or was it unethical? I mean, what was he?
No, honestly, I think he was smart and good at his job, And I kind of think that, this is where I feel like really the media needs to start taking a closer look at itself and its own role in all of this stuff, because yes, it's very easy to say, oh, these PR firms or these, internal PR guys were doing all this stuff, but it shouldn't have been that effective. So what if some guy at Mobil Oil calls and yells at you? That should not make you change your approach to a story. And I don't know. I mean, that to me was a really interesting thing that I didn't even necessarily start out with in that season, was just how this relationship between companies and journalists has kind of swung back and forth over the years. So in the very early days of kind of the muckrakers and things, they had quite an antagonistic relationship with companies and with like people in power in general. It was like kind of considered to be a journalist's job to, hold powerful people to account. And then you sort of start to see, you see the PR industry, gain in prominence, and you start to see kind of this idea of access journalism emerging more and more, where people are sort of trading, antagonism for access. So, they can get into the factory and see how things are made and stuff like that. And that, again, was very intentional. I mean, a guy who worked for Standard Oil created the press release. And for the first couple of years, newspapers were so surprised that companies were sharing information with them willingly that they just printed them.
Great. Well,
Yeah.
To me, what he was doing, obviously, there's a spectrum of what's ethical behavior. And like you said, he was just doing his job really well. And I think one of the outcomes, and he wasn't the only one responsible for this, but it was a long-term approach to creating a persona around a corporation. Like you've created an identity, and now all of a sudden they're just not this big, faceless, awful thing. And it occurred to me is that we still haven't created a persona for the climate, have we?
No, I mean, that's a very good point. And Herb Schmertz at the time, because he was in public affairs, which kind of crossed over into lobbying and law and PR, he was very active in pushing the Buckley v. Vallejo case too, which was kind of the precursor to Citizens United, to literally give companies, the rights of people. That really like opened the floodgates for kind of corporate free speech. So he wasn't just tackling it from the perspective of, calling up editors and getting mad at them or, yelling at journalists or whatever. He also was trying to change the entire structure of media. And a big part of it also, was this whole corporate personhood thing and creating a personality and therefore kind of a sense in the public that, Mobil was a certain type of person and therefore should be given a certain amount of leeway.
Well, or all people should be treated fairly, right? Like if you've humanized them, then there's this sense of like fairness, and it was a genius approach, but it immediately occurred to me, we haven't done that with the climate. That's
very true. In fact, we kept human beings out of the climate conversation for a very long time. And I'm not sure why. It's an interesting question.
And I guess a follow-up to that is, we've both been doing climate communication for a while, and I think of Smertz and, plugging along, doing what he's doing very effectively, but there's this notion, and I've worked for nonprofits, and I've worked for, the National Park Service, and I think people who are in the climate space and the climate movement, there's this sort of embedded idea of what we're doing is kind of noble. Look, we're trying to save the planet. And along with that nobility, I think kind of instills a naiveness about how things get done. And it's just baked into the system. And I think it affects our ability to actually communicate more effectively. And and it leads me to the, I guess, point is like, well, am I proposing we communicate unethically or more, I guess, playing for keeps? And I don't have the solution, but I look at Smertz and think, gosh, look how effective he was. And I'm tired of the climate movement just thinking good things will happen because we're doing something noble here.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I remember I interviewed Dan Ariely, the guy who wrote Predictably Irrational, a while ago, probably 15 years ago or something now, and about specifically environmental issues and the approach of the environmental movement to trying to get people to change their ideas or behavior, things like that. And he was telling me this story about how he had consulted for a nonprofit and that he was trying to basically kind of teach them how to use the same tactics that Coca-Cola had used, and that they, acted like there was something wrong with using those tactics, and he was kind of like, if the sort of the good guys are intentionally avoiding using what we know to be the most effective tactics, that's not good. And I don't know. Yeah, I still run across that today, people feeling like, I don't know. I'm not sure what they think they're going to accomplish by being like the more noble, side of the communications field. Cause Herb Schmertz was a character too. He got very involved in all these things. Like when he was doing stuff with PBS, he was picking shows. He was involved in casting. He was looking at scripts. And when he left Mobil, initially his plan was to start a film production company because he was like, it was kind of funny actually reading this in his memoirs that I think he really thought that that he wasn't just the money guy, right? Like that he was really a part of the creative team. And it was like almost as soon as he was not connected to Mobil's money, that was the end of his film career, But But anyway, yeah, I don't understand what it's going to take for climate folks, especially, if people genuinely feel like this is an emergency and time is running out, you got to use whatever tools are there.
Yeah, and I'm not even. I totally agree. Like, so the rhetoric that we hear is like, we have 5 years, we have 10 years until it's too late. And if it's truly that case, then you think we would have seen some behaviors on people acting. And I don't mean like tying yourself to a pipeline, which I'm not necessarily discouraging either. It's just when it comes to the rhetoric and the tactics that we use, we need our own herb schmerts. And I don't. Some people would not agree with that, but if the stakes are really that high, why haven't we seen more of this? And I like to think of my podcast, I take the high road 99% of the time, and maybe I'm part of that problem too, but I'd love to see someone with his tactics come along.
Yes, totally. Absolutely. Yeah. I often thought about that when I was researching this season. I was like, man, it'd be great to have, to be able to read about the environmental version of this person. And, we've had some, I think, Ida Tarbell and Rachel Carson and lots of these people who have helped to sort of shine a light on what the industry is doing. But I don't know. I don't know that there's a green version of herb schmerts that I've come across. We need it.
Right. And, and I look at just even the presidential race, it's just Republicans versus Democrats. And, Democrats can play somewhat dirty, but there's one side that will literally say anything. And Democrats aren't willing to go there quite yet. So even though they might use hyperbole or whatever, it's just like it's asymmetrical warfare. One side will say anything, and the other will be like, well, they feel bound by some sense of, I just can't say he's going to go murder your children. Whereas the other side might say that,
Yeah. Yeah. I know. It's very, I know. Whenever I see a sort of right-wing conspiracy theory about the Democrats, I think I saw something about, Fox News was saying that COVID was a hoax created by the Democrats. And I'm like, honestly, I wish the Democrats were capable of that level of craven politicking.
I know.
They are not.
All right. Well, I encourage my listeners to go check out, all the seasons, of course, but this, just really fascinating on how an industry, just decided to change the rules of the game, and we have much to learn through that process.
Yeah.
So we're doing another major pivot here, and you wrote an essay in a new book, and the book is All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. And so it's a book it has a bunch of different essays, and you wrote one of the essays for it. Could you give a little bit more background on the book?
Yes, it is all women, I believe. Yeah, it is. It was organized by Dr. Ayanna Johnson and Dr. Catherine Wilkinson, and they wanted to pull together a book of essays and poems from women doing various things in the climate space. So there's a really wide range of folks in there. There's, a NASA scientist and a poet and then me. So yeah, it's great. I think they did a really good job of curating this collection, and we've gotten good feedback on it, and it's a good mix of things, kind of all over the map on climate.
I haven't read the whole book, but I've read your essay that was shared with me. And, it was weird. I read it first before we had our first phone call, and you seem like a very cheerful person. And I hope that doesn't come off condescending in any way, but just it was very positive. But the essay to me, very dire, there was a melancholy kind of atmosphere to it. And just maybe you could elaborate some of the things that you talked about.
Yeah, well, I talked about what it feels like to be raising kids right now. And, I feel like this kind of generation of parents is the first to really feel like we might not be able to guarantee our kids a better future, And I think I wrote about this weird tension between sort of the day-to-day kind of present tasks of parenting and the kind of constant future track you have in your mind, not just about, what they will do as individuals, but now, what the world will be like in 15, 20 years. So I know there's like one part where I talk about my oldest kid has been really obsessed with wanting to know everything there is to know about college, and he's 8, and I'm I sometimes catch myself being like, is college going to still be a thing for him? I don't know. Like, is college even a good play for kids growing up today? Like, maybe he should learn how to farm, you know? I don't know. I guess it is kind of depressing, but it's a fear I have.
You know, I've heard this talked about a bit, and I don't know if you listened to the episode. I listened to most of it, but I think you're friends with Marianne Hitt in the No Place Like Home podcast, and they had a whole episode of should you have children, or some headline like that.
Yes.
And to me, I always kind of thought most people that were questioning having children is more about, do I want them to come and sort of use resources, and are they going to contribute to the problem? Do I have a responsibility? Mm-hmm. And then a little bit less of, oh, do I want children because I'm bringing them into a potential hellscape? And I wasn't quite sure in your essay. What was your, I think it was more of that latter one. Would that be accurate?
Yeah. You know, it's funny because I did a project maybe 7 or so years ago now where, myself and a group of other journalists did kind of like we crowdfunded long form climate journalism, and then we syndicated it to various national outlets. And in the course of that, we did a project on population for The Guardian. So again, this is like 7 or 8 years ago. And at that time, the entire conversation around shouldn't I have kids and what does climate have to do with it was around resources. And, you know, is it irresponsible of me, especially as a person in the West, to have kids that will be, you know, sort of resource intensive on the world and all that kind of stuff. And I've seen just in the last couple of years that really dramatically changing to people worrying about the impact on the kids they might have, you know, which is scary and kind of depressing that is something that people are feeling like they have to consider when they're deciding whether or not to have kids. I have to say, I didn't think about any of this stuff when I had kids. I don't know why. It was like just completely like a separate part of my brain. I don't know. But yeah. And then, you know, I do talk to quite a few mothers in the climate space who have a very different approach, you know, and who think like, well, and to be clear, I'm not like a climate doomer who thinks that like my kids are headed for apocalypse. It's just like, it's a thing that definitely, I think, probably helps to drive my work in this space. And I think for me, having my own kids kind of made me that much more aware about what kind of world we're leaving to future generations. But yeah, I don't know. I had this conversation with Kate Marvel, who's a NASA scientist, a few months ago, and she was like, I know what will happen if we don't do anything, and I know what will happen if we do something, and my focus is really on trying to create the kind of society that I want my kids to grow up in, and like trying not to focus too much on what happens if we don't achieve that, you know, which I think is probably a good approach.
I follow her on Twitter, and I just love that name, Dr. Marvel. Just a great name, too.
She's a superhero.
Right. Yeah. Well, listen, my own thoughts on that, and I've touched upon it just a little bit, not nearly as thoughtful as you did in that essay. I encourage people to read the essay, and it's more of just a practical reason. It's like, well, people that don't care about climate change, they are going to keep having children. And if like this climate people decide they're not having children, they're not going to grow up to vote. They're not going to grow up to learn those values. What the hell are we doing not having children? And that's not going to change. And anyway, that's more of a practical. And maybe you disagree with this because you wrote an essay, but when I first saw the No Place Like Home, the headline was just so glaring. Like, I think it was, should we have children? And I feel beyond the arguments that they're making, which, you know, very thoughtful episode, but how people are creating an identity for the climate movement. And it's like, now look at them saying, don't have kids. And in some ways, that's even more harmful than the nuance point you might try, you know, you're trying to make with it. And so, I hate to say it, but we have to worry about our identity as a movement.
Totally. I actually find the whole population discussion troubling, and especially because I've seen it now come up 2 or 3 times just in my career. And I don't know. I feel like and this was actually the point that I made in this Guardian story a while back, was that, every person's reproductive choices entail a whole constellation of factors. And I also just think that you start to get into the sort of individual choice versus systemic change thing. But then on top of that, there's this very dark history of eugenics in that conversation, of like deciding who should and shouldn't be having children. And I don't know. I totally understand why it might impact someone's decision around having kids. But I hope that as a movement, we will not get into the sort of lecturing, you shouldn't have kids if you care about the climate kind of stance,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And listen, to my listeners, this is a minefield for me, being, the male. I'm not suggesting you have kids based on what you want, any circumstance. I'm just talking more about the conversation that's going on out there.
Yeah, like the framing of it.
Yeah.
I know. And then I there's also this thing too, where I have seen personally a number of women who actually just don't want kids, who have kind of wrapped that decision up in some kind of like noble crusade for climate that I don't find helpful at all. I'm like, first of all, it's completely okay as a woman to decide you don't have kids just because you don't want kids for a variety of reasons. And secondly, I don't think it's helpful to paint the choice not to have children as like a noble self-sacrifice on behalf of the climate. I just feel like that's really dangerous territory to get into.
So you host another podcast, and I think these other issues come up. It's called Hot Take, and it's with Mary Anais Hagler. Did I get that right?
Mary Anais, yeah.
Anais. Mm-hmm. And so that gives you a little, I think, bit more flexibility, and you are, I think, covering more about climate communication, the climate movement. But could you give a little background on that podcast?
Yeah. It actually started out as sort of a media criticism podcast about climate coverage, which felt so niche to me when Mary and I were first talking about it. But there's actually so much to discuss because the way that we talk about this issue intersects with so many different things. Like we were just talking about reproductive choice and gender, right? There's also race and class and all kinds of immigration issues and food and just all kinds of things. So, for example, we had on a guy, David Tamarkin, who's the editor of the website Eater, a few episodes ago, and got into this really interesting conversation about how the culture of food media has really not accounted for climate. So he was talking about this kind of overlap of masculinity and meat eating, for example, that happens in like the foodie space, or the emphasis on ingredients that can only be sourced from really far away. Things like that, where it's like the food media space has sort of always been very aspirational and not really tied to reality. But he feels like we're getting to a place where it feels sort of like superficial and unethical to act as though that's possible anymore. So anyway, just it takes some surprising turns, and we get into a lot of conversations that we never quite expect when we start out on an episode.
This podcast, America Adapts, focuses on how we're going to adapt to climate change. And I get into climate communications, like this episode is around that, and I love having those conversations. And so your own experiences with your podcast, how often is adaptation coming up? Is it an area that's kind of emerging for you? Or do you feel like you've always covered it?
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like it's kind of ebbed. It's kind of like come and gone over the years. So I covered adaptation a lot, maybe 15 years ago. And then I feel like I sort of lost track of it. And then started covering it again more recently. And there is something that I've noticed emerging in the way that people talk about adaptation that I think is worth paying attention to. It's sort of a resurgence of this. Like, I know you've seen this for years, the whole weird like adaptation versus mitigation thing,
Right.
which is so ridiculous because of course, like we need to do all of the things all at the same time. But there's something about that now too, where I'm seeing like a lot of progressives even look at adaptation as something that like, oh, that's something that only like doomers who've given up on mitigation are going to be into it. I'm like, oh no, this again. I mean, similar to the whole reproduction conversation, I feel like these things sort of cycle in and out of the media and sort of like the public conversation about these things. And we're having another one of these moments where these things are being presented as though they're in conflict with each other. And they're just not. And then, on the flip side too, I do see some people, it's weird. It kind of tends to be gendered just in my personal experience of this, where it's like there's a certain type of tech guy who is like all about adaptation only. And then like a certain type of environmental activist woman who's like, all technology is bad forever, boo, and I'm just like, ugh, this is not going to be helpful. So yeah.
It comes up on occasion, but I make a point on my podcast to keep bringing it. It's like, all right, we need you guys on the mitigation side to do your thing or we're not going to be able to adapt to it. But meanwhile, we need to adapt to what's happening and what's coming quickly. And I find, at least when it comes to the adaptation side, especially I have, practitioners, I have academics. It's actually, I think, the happy side of the climate change conversation, because a lot,
yes.
Even when I hear from listeners, they're saying, oh, I like the fact that people are doing something now proactively. And rarely does a guest ever get sort of doom and gloom. Oh, well, there's no way. It doesn't come up. And so I feel I'm actually kind of lucky. I'm more on the positive space, but I make the point to say, we need you to do mitigation. In no ways adaptation taking away. It's a different skill set. Please keep what you're doing over there. And some people just are trying to pick a fight. If you're not like on their camp, they just, like you said, they're just looking to pick a fight.
Yeah, I think so too. And I do think one thing that I am starting to see more of that I think is really good to see is people thinking about kind of the stuff that needs to happen around more, technical or physical adaptation to make it work, So for example, like the managed retreat conversation, right? I think there was a while there where people were just so freaked out by that term that they didn't even want to talk about it, And I am starting to see people realize, okay, if we're going to build different systems or rethink how we're building cities or rethink how we're moving people around, any of these things, like we're going to have to also address sort of social structures and all of these kind of soft things that go along with people changing how they live.
Yeah, and I don't want to give the impression that there's plenty of controversial things going on with adaptation. And so managed retreat, like I'm like, Miami, you need to move, like the whole city need to move. Yeah. And then we're climate justice, environmental justice issues are coming up a lot more. And it's just that, who gets the resources to do what they're doing. And so there's lots of controversy in adaptation actions. Yeah, and that's emerging big time. And managed retreat, I'm actually having another conversation about that this week. And it's a fascinating subject.
It's so interesting. And I mean, that it intersects with the justice question so much too, because like who's deciding who's moving where and, who's paying for that and I don't know. It's just, there's a lot to figure out.
Yeah, we are rewiring or restructuring a society in slow motion, but it's going to happen faster. And these are all just conversations that need to happen. So,
yeah.
Okay. So with Hot Take, I don't know if you've covered this much, but when it comes to the media in climate change, I think we can say they failed us in many ways. But I think you could make an argument they're getting a little bit better. And I want to talk about wildfires briefly as an example. And so California, the most recent wildfires, and then Australia about a year and a half ago, I felt, and I might still be in my bubble, but the media, even in that country and then this country covering that country, connected it to climate change pretty well. And I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I thought so too. I think in general, I'm just seeing less and less of the sort of hesitancy that we used to see even, 3 to 5 years ago around connecting things like, this year's hurricane season or the gigafire in California or the brush fires in Australia to climate change. And also an unwillingness to take seriously the people that want to have these debates about, how, well, technically it's more about forest management or whatever, which that was maybe something that I felt like the media didn't do a great job of. And I think will be helped by more outlets just getting sharper on climate stuff in general. But this idea that we need to find one single driver for everything it's just such a problem. It opens the floodgates for all kinds of just kind of false narratives. And, I went on the media around the California fires because there was this whole disinformation campaign initially about how, protesters were starting the fires, and then that sort of pivoted into, there was at one point a campaign around blaming the Sierra Club for the fires because the Sierra Club had stopped people from logging, and that was the reason that, forest management had gone wrong. Right. It's just okay, we need people to be able to understand that these issues are layered and complicated, and that climate change is a factor that interacts with other factors, So yeah, but I do feel like it's improving. People are starting to get there.
I want to see that headline, the county commission that allowed the development in this sort of wildfire zone. That should be the story, It's
exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's building approaches, permitting, forest management, even water management. That's another thing where I'm just we have a dam near here. There's this whole county that I think is becoming less and less habitable too, because it basically floods every winter and burns down every summer. It's just it's not good. But part of it is like the dam was built for a precipitation pattern that no longer exists, So we need to okay, we know that now. What are we going to do about it? We're just going to let it overflow and flood every year? That seems silly.
Once again, I think the fires just demonstrate how hard it is to, make climate change relevant to people, because you think about wildfires that if people are impacted directly, they're right next in the fire zone, they don't care necessarily that climate change is making this worse. They want immediate help. But then people that aren't impacted by those fires and they're far away, they're like, oh, that looks troubling. I'm glad I'm not living there. And again, the climate change is not raised to that level of urgency. And, it's such a hole to start in.
Yeah. Actually, we had an interesting conversation about that on Hot Take recently about, there was a new paper that came out maybe 2 months ago about whether or not natural disasters increase or drive policy, increase politicians' willingness to pass climate policy. And the answer that paper gave was no, based on the fact that, Hurricane Sandy hadn't really done anything, all of these things. And they sort of came to the conclusion that the only thing that really eventually drives policy is grassroots organizing and people just sort of pushing the ball down the road year after year. But we were talking to Justin Warland, who's the environmental reporter for Time magazine, and he was talking about how, yes, okay, maybe you can't point to some catastrophic disaster and the policy that it generated. But, he gave the example of living in DC. He's like, we have this flash flood thing happening all the time now. And it almost doesn't even make the national news because it's not that big of a deal, but it's this sort of constant hum where you're this is not normal. This is not how we were living even 5 or 6 years ago. That, maybe does kind of make people think a bit more. I hear more people in California actually talk about the lingering smoke than the urgent danger from wildfire.
Interesting. Well, and I'm not sure, have people reached out to you? You just said natural disaster, and
extreme weather.
Right.
Yes.
I get my hand slapped quite a bit on that one. And I agree with what they're trying to say there, but It's so easy just to say it in the media. That's, I guess, one area that they're failing big time, because I see natural disaster all the time still.
Yes, totally. Yeah, I do. And that, I don't know, that kind of stuff I do think it's important to encourage those kinds of shifts in language to help people kind of grasp, what's happening. But I forget too sometimes.
I have a colleague at the World Wildlife Fund. She does disasters, Anita, and she's always there. It's just like, Doug, you did it again. So, Anita, if you're listening, I'm bringing it up with Amy. All right. So just checking in. I do want to kind of wrap it up soon. There's a whole section that I'm not going to even get to, damn it. But there's a couple points I want to get. So that
Sure.
Just a couple more questions, and then this has been fabulous, though. So we just had a big election, and apparently we don't have closure on that, but we're just going to go ahead and say we have a Biden administration coming in. What will that mean for Drilled and I guess all your climate podcasts?
I mean, I think it will mean more of the same, to be honest. I think the fossil fuel industry is not going away anytime soon. It remains to be seen whether the Senate will be Republican or Democrat controlled, and that will definitely have an impact on what sorts of policies get passed. And then, I think I'm under no illusion that the Democrats don't also need to be held accountable. So, we ran a story on the Drilled website, maybe like a month ago, looking at Moniz, who is rumored to be Biden's pick for Department of Energy head, and the various issues attendant to him. So, yeah, I think there will be things to cover for quite a while. And, on Hot Take, we're kind of like following the story no matter where it goes. So, yeah, I think the market for climate podcasts will remain hot, to make a terrible pun.
Well, if the funding gets a bit better, of course, the topic will keep us busy for hundreds of years. So
that's true. That will help. Yeah.
Okay. And so last question, and I asked this of all my guests, if you could recommend one person to come on the podcast that I can talk to, who would it be?
Have you had Kate Marvel on yet?
No, I have not.
Oh, she would be great. Yes. Highly recommend her. What about Leah Stokes?
No, I have not either. They just started it's Wilkinson and Leah Stokes that have just started their own podcast, right?
That's right. A Matter of Degrees. Yeah. Leah's, I think, very good on adaptation stuff, and on especially talking about some of the weird, unnecessary debates that crop up.
That's a good one. And I asked this question the last time Dr. Michael Mann was on, and I asked, and he said Leah Stokes. So I need to follow up on that.
She's great. If you need her info, I'm happy to send it to you. She has all her own equipment and is very good at recording herself too. So that's also
good. She does enough media that she's figured it out. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I guess why is there anyone who's been a character in any of your episodes you think might actually be a good follow-up to? You've talked to crabbers. You've talked to all sorts of folks.
The crabbers would be really good. And in particular, there was one woman that I talked to in our second season who I found fascinating because she is a named plaintiff in a lawsuit against the oil companies surrounding sort of their efforts to just kind of keep information about climate change out of the public sphere and or spin it in certain ways. But she still doesn't actually think that humans are impacting the climate. And I just found that really, really interesting because her whole motivation was to join the suit was that she was shown, primary documents where various oil companies had gotten, really it was mostly they had gotten patents for adapting their coastal refineries and offshore platforms to sea level rise. And it was like right at the same time, that they were kind of ramping up efforts to tell everybody else that the jury was really still out on climate change and whether it was even happening. And she just felt like that was really unfair. And I think that, that is like a whole perspective that I think we could stand to dig into a bit more,
Yeah. And I was listening to those and just, that to me, I would love to get you back on the podcast and some other topics and like developing narratives around people in the climate movement. And I think the Crabbers, you developed a narrative, and I have certain problems with narratives that are developed, and not necessarily yours, but I'm just saying that could be very interesting because.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, because that's the trick, right? Is like, I don't know. If you're developing any kind of narrative, you're inherently influencing or trying to influence or frame the story in a way. So
definitely.
Yeah, it's super interesting.
Well, Amy, this has been better than I thought it'd be. I love this conversation, and like I said, I'd love to have future conversations with you, maybe check-ins once in a while where we can kind of go over some issues. But thanks for what you do. You're a leader in the field. You're an inspiration to a lot of us climate podcasters, and thanks for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much. It was so fun to talk to you.
Okay, adapters, that is a wrap. Thanks to Amy for coming on the show. What a treat to host Amy. She is a legend in climate podcast circles, and I was geeking out just chatting about climate podcasting. She's amazing at what she does and has elevated environmental journalism to an art form. Definitely check out her podcast network at Critical Frequency. She covers a lot of ground. I'm fascinated by the climate change movement creating a new persona, one that is likely to capture the public's imagination, and then creating real desire to seek change. We are definitely not there yet, but people like Amy are getting very creative in setting new narratives for this sector. Also, this is my first episode since the election, the presidential election. We don't endorse candidates here at America Adapts, but I'm obviously very happy with the election of Joe Biden. America needs to reboot how we approach climate change, and Biden was the only option in that respect. It'll be interesting to see who he brings into the administration and how we can quickly get back into the Paris Climate Agreement. Definitely great news on the climate front. Okay, so if you're interested in highlighting your adaptation work in a podcast via America Adapts, think about using a podcast. It doesn't have to be a webinar. It doesn't have to be a boring old white paper. Sponsoring a podcast allows you to focus on the work you're doing and sharing with climate professionals from around the world. I normally connect with folks at conferences and meetings, but that has been shut down for the last year. So definitely reach out to me directly if you have some ideas for this type of episode. That's how I keep the lights running. So maybe your organization wants to highlight the great work you're doing. Email me at americaadapts@gmail.com. So most of you have heard me talk about the work I'm doing with Simpatico Studios, which is completely independent from the podcast. I'm hosting live talk shows on the Climate Adaptation channel. I'm interviewing climate adaptation experts, clean energy entrepreneurs, and academics from around the world. It is a whole channel dedicated to climate change, and the team at Simpatico has me booked up through the spring, interviewing some of the most interesting people in this space. Definitely sign up to check out the platform, and yes, it's free. A link is in the show notes, or just go to simpatico.com, and that's with a C, Simpatico. There's a huge archive of interviews on every topic imaginable. Definitely go check it out. Some final housekeeping. Don't forget to join the Facebook page and the Facebook community group. The group is private, but just sign up. I'll approve you right away. We have some interesting conversations, or people post their own work or other podcasts there. Definitely check it out. On that note, I love hearing from you. Take the time to email me just to say who you are. And if you're in the field, let me know what you do. It's very valuable to me to know who my listeners are, and it helps drive the content I create. Do it. I know you want to. I'm at americaadapts@gmail.com. Send me an email, and the website is americaadapts.org. Okay, adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.